The only thing that's certain in life, or so they say, are death and taxes. Death rituals in the Philippines is one story taking place in Asia now. Welcome everyone to Asia Now. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading this week's episode. Now, this week my family is in town and I'm spending some much needed downtime with them. But since I did take that extended hiatus when my father-in-law passed away, I didn't want to skip an episode so soon after resuming production. So this week is going to be a very special podcast, a very personal podcast. No guests, just me. While I have unfortunately attended several funerals in the United States, I have really never attended one in Asia, never attended one in the Philippines, and certainly never had to say goodbye to an in-law. Doing so was a very personal and profound experience. And while in this episode I'm going to share my experiences, I'm not going to share any family details. I am going to talk about the rituals surrounding death and burials that I experienced with my wife's family, but that's it. Before starting, I do need to preface this by saying this isn't going to be a comprehensive list. I may get some things wrong, and this really isn't meant to be a definitive work on Chinese or Filipino practices as it pertains to burial and death rituals. It is a representative discussion and story of what I personally experienced. So let me begin by sharing a little bit about my wife's family. Now, she is Filipina, I guess I should say, and has lived there all the way up through the end of college. But ethnically, she is Chinese, and her family ancestry hails from the Fujian region of China, the southern portion of China. So when she was growing up in the provinces outside of Manila, she spoke Mandarin, she spoke Hokkien, Fujian, she spoke English, of course, Tagalog, and the regional dialect in Pangasinan. That all being said, it was very interesting going back there and seeing how all of these different cultures, the influence of the Spanish on the Philippines, the true Filipino cultures, the Chinese cultures, how they all married together. And when you approach the end of life, when you start looking at death rituals, you see that marriage also comes into play. So I'm going to go through a list of things that I observed, things that I witnessed while there. So first up, I want to talk about colors. Now, in the United States, typically when you're in mourning, when someone has passed away in your family, or that you're mourning the loss of someone special to you, you wear black. That's a very distinctive color, the color of mourning. And pretty much around the world that I have traveled, that's pretty much the same thing. Now, in Chinese cultures, that's also fairly representative. You wear black. And according to some of our family members that I spoke to while we were there in the provinces, they used to wear black. The Chinese community used to wear black in the Philippines as well. But at some point, they said that their community decided to change and no longer wear black. They wear white. So the color of mourning for the Chinese population, at least where my wife, her family is from, is white. And it's very interesting to see that because you're walking down the street and you'll see someone wear nothing but white. And the first thing that comes to my mind is like, oh, trying to be, cool. You want something reflective to not to be hot in the sunlight. But for the Chinese population, you instantly think of, oh, that person has lost someone. They're in mourning. And it's not just white or black, but it's the way that the clothes are worn. So if it is someone in your family, your spouse, you have to wear all white. In fact, while we were there during the funeral, I didn't have any white clothes with me, so I had to go to the tailor and have white pants made, have white shirts made, go out and buy some white shoes and just white clothes in general. And that was very hard because at that particular time of year, it wasn't time for white clothes to be sold. So that's why we had them made. And plus, I'm 6'4", so trying to get something in my size isn't always the easiest thing. Now, the other thing I mentioned, to me, when I see someone wearing white clothes, it's just white clothes. But to someone in the Chinese community, you instantaneously see that they are in mourning. And that was one of the things that was shared with me, is that like all cultures, there are certain beliefs, superstitions, if you will, that some individuals adhere to. And they shared with me that sometimes some businesses will not allow people in who are wearing all black or all white because they are in mourning, for the belief that death will follow them into their business and it'll create an unlucky circumstance. So I thought that was very interesting, that during this period that you're wearing the white clothes, or in some cases the black clothes, you can actually not be allowed into certain places. So I thought that was very, very interesting. Now, with regards to the clothes, there are actually rules on how long you're supposed to wear them. So my mother-in-law has to wear white clothes, all white, for a period of 1 year. That's the period of mourning. She has to wear them for an entire year. My sister-in-laws don't have to wear all white, but at least white blouses for an entire year. And that was going back and forth too, because some of our aunts and uncles said it's not 1 year for my sister-in-laws, just 49 days from the time of death. So there's a little wiggle room there. I'm not really sure because, as I said, we're getting different answers all the time. My wife is exempt from that. And this was also very interesting to hear. So you often hear in East Asian families how the son is the most important thing in that family. Everything revolves around the son. The first son specifically, they're the one that really is at the top of the food chain in the family. Doesn't matter if they are firstborn, secondborn, whatever, but the very first son gets all the rights, gets all the attention. But as a daughter, once you marry, and this was coming from one of our aunts, once you marry, you're considered to be out of the family. So what we were told is that as soon as her father was buried, she was considered free from having to wear the white. Since she was married out of the family, she was exempt from wearing the white. And I thought that was really interesting because from a Western perspective, you don't think of just marriage as a severing of ties. You think of that as, yes, you're separating from your old families. Both of you, the husband and the wife, are separating from your families, and you form a new unit together. But in this particular instance, you're married out, so your obligation ends at that point. And I thought that was very, very interesting as well. Now, the other thing that was very much a surprise for me, and we actually had some conversations with other family members while we were there, was the notion of the body's preparation. Now, my father passed away in 1991. My grandmother passed away a few years after that, and both of them were cremated. I plan on being cremated. My mother, we've unfortunately had to talk about this because she's, of course, in advanced age. She's going to be cremated. But for many people, you still have the notion that you want to be buried. So you have to preserve the body, find a casket, and prepare for the burial. My uncle, who was actually a service member from the United States in the Army, who was stationed in the Philippines during World War II, survived the internment in Japanese prisoner of war camp. He was buried. And the notion of a wake, he was the very first wake I ever went to. And it was very surreal. And I'll never forget this. I was probably just at a graduate school, so we're talking maybe 20 years ago. And I remember going into the funeral hall and seeing the open casket and feeling very nervous about going up and seeing him lying inside the casket. Even though I had been to cadaver labs and had seen hundreds of skinned animals and even corpses that we use for dissection, I had never seen a family member presented in that way. And it was a little bit of a surreal experience. Now, in the Philippines, most people are still buried. And this was the thing that I thought was interesting. So, traditional Filipino belief, it's a Catholic nation, and you saw how many people came out in support of the Pope when Pope Francis went there in January. But there are a number of different beliefs regarding the wake in the Philippines. And for many in the Philippines, the wake period can be 9 days long. And I'm a little sketchy on the details in that. I did research it, but I never got a really good answer. It had something to do with something that Jesus did in terms of waiting a period or getting an answer or something along those lines. But for many people, you have a wake for 9 days. And to me, that just seems incredibly long. So we actually did have a wake for my father-in-law for over a week. So he was prepared, he was put in the casket and taken to the church and then essentially laid in state for a period of 1 week. And the reason why it was so long is that many things in Chinese culture revolve around certain dates. There's a certain date that is good luck, the most opportune time to accomplish something. There's this huge red book with stars and times and everything that this is the time that people need to do things. When I proposed to my wife, I had to speak to her mother and get the exact time window when I could ask for her permission to marry, because that was the most good luck for us as a couple. When we got married, there was a certain time window when we had to get married. And likewise, there's a certain time window when putting an individual into their tomb is the best luck for the family. So doing that action at that time eliminates bad luck for the rest of the family. So the body lies in state until that period. So we had to essentially wait at the church 24 hours a day until that time period. And in addition to that, it's very common in the Philippines to have a mass or a religious service every night. It was very taxing because, and this is the one thing I thought was very difficult, is that, you know, in the West, when you have a wake, typically maybe 1 or 2 hours, and then it's done, you have the memorial service, and then you bury the body. In the Philippines, at least in our community, I shouldn't say our community, my wife's community, it was a longer, prolonged experience every day. And you were there in the church with Papa in his tomb, open casket. And this did allow people who were traveling from farther distances away to come in and pay their respects. But it was very, I think in some ways it makes it a little bit more difficult for the family because you're there every day. And some people even mentioned that he simply looked as if he was sleeping, just ready to wake up. And when you have a shorter wake, I think it enables individuals to put closure a little bit easier than if you protract it so many days. And as I mentioned, that area was open 24 hours a day. We weren't there 24 hours a day, but a lot of times we were in shifts. So we had one person stay overnight. My wife and I would typically go in the morning, and then in the afternoon we would leave, and then some people would come back and have the mass in the evening. It was a very taxing experience. When my father passed away, we had a wake of sorts at our house. But again, it was a very short. There was a limit on it. And once it was over, it was over. That was the end of it. And if we didn't want to deal with speaking with people, there were friends and family who could run interference. But the expectation, at least to us, was that we had to be always at the church and open to speak with everyone who came there. And that was certainly taxing at times as well. Not to mention always making sure that there was tea, coffee, and snacks for people while they were there. The other thing at the wake that was, I guess, surprising to me was the manner in which gifts were given. Now, typically in the United States, when someone passes away, it's very common to send flowers or you make a donation in their name. Perhaps you give food to the family so they don't have to worry about cooking or anything like that. Certainly flowers were given to the funeral home when my father-in-law passed away. The large, ornate, stand-up, I really don't want to call them bouquets, but the enormous arrangements that you typically see in China, South Korea, Japan when a business opens, you see those being delivered from businesses, from colleagues, from politicians who may have known the deceased. You see those being brought in and displayed. But you also see the monetary gifts come in. And this is something that I still haven't quite wrapped my head around. In various cultures during, say, New Year's or during special holidays, in China, in Chinese, ang pao, you greet an elder, you bow, and then you're presented with a red envelope with typically cash inside. A typical gift at a funeral like this is also a donation to the family, but it's done in a very unique way. So the donation is made, and then there's a long strip, a very long strip, with the information of who gave the donation and the exact amount of that donation. And then that's posted on the wall. So everyone walking in can actually see how much everyone else donated. And I really thought that was surreal. Now, to me, I couldn't read any of it because it was all in Chinese, but you could see that the top portion of the strip of paper had the name, and then the bottom portion was how much money. And I thought that was, quite frankly, I thought it was bizarre and almost a way of possibly bragging how much money you could donate. And I still have very mixed emotions about putting that kind of information out there. I think that's more of a private thing, not so much wanting to put things out there just to say, hey, I did this. But then again, I'm a fairly private person. So that was the wake. And then, of course, you have the services every night, the final service before you actually have the procession to the funeral location, the cemetery. And that was also very interesting as well, because we had the last memorial service at the church. And then we had to wait while they closed the coffin and brought it to the hearse. Now, when that happened, we couldn't actually look at the coffin. We had to look down at the ground. And then they brought it into the hearse. And then we took maybe a 15, 20-minute walk from the church location to the Chinese cemetery. And this was a very slow procession, walking very slowly behind the hearse. And there's some ritual related to that. It's called the push. And there's a very special way in which you are supposed to, quote unquote, push the hearse to the cemetery. And that was really never fully explained to me. But I was instructed that I needed to follow all the instructions because I had to do things correctly, because if I didn't, there'd be bad luck involved. Now, before we actually entered the cemetery, my wife and my sisters-in-law and myself had to scurry from the back portion of the hearse, the end of the hearse, before the hearse and kneel on our knees before the hearse passed the threshold of the gate. I'm still unclear why exactly that was. I know it was to pay respect, to pay homage to Papa as he was entering the cemetery, but that was one of the things that was made very clear to me in terms of the procession to the funeral. From there, we actually went to the gravesite, had another short ceremony, and then once more, it was time to put Papa into his interment site. Now, this was also, I think, very interesting as well. So, like with the coffin being transferred from the church into the hearse where you couldn't look at it, while the coffin was being transferred from the hearse to a stand and then into the interment site, we couldn't look at it either. So there was always this portion where we had to look down at the ground. Now, from here on out, we had to kind of split things because there are a number of different rituals that have to be followed. Now, the first thing is like I mentioned, we're wearing white the entire time. That's the color of mourning. When you actually complete the burial, you're supposed to take off the clothes that you're wearing and burn them. So prior to actually having this final ceremony, before the one that started at the church and concluded at the gravesite, we actually rented new clothes to wear on top of our normal clothes so we could take those off and then burn them. Then, as soon as we took the clothes off, handed them to my mother-in-law for her to burn them, I went with my wife and her older sister to take the portrait that we had of her father to the home. Now, this was something that was also explained to me, is that following the interment, the oldest child has to take the portrait of the deceased to the family home and hang it at the family altar. So we had to do that. And she was the only person that could hold the frame. She was the only person that could hang the frame. She was the only person that could do this. This was absolutely her responsibility. And it was really important for us to make sure that we did this. Now, I spoke before about the reason why we had such a long wait for a wake was because we had to wait for this good luck period, this time window, when we could perform the burial. So we literally had a 2-hour window to hold the funeral mass, go to the gravesite, conduct the last mass there, intern the coffin, burn the clothes, go to the family house, hang the picture, seal the interment monument, and have everything done within 2 hours. Now, as I just mentioned, monument. In the Chinese community, at least where my wife's family is from, you don't bury the coffins. You put them in a tomb and eventually create a mausoleum around it. And that falls back into a very Filipino tradition, the Day of the Dead, which is very common in many Spanish cultures as well. On November 1st, you go back to the family grave sites to pay respect and to spend time with your family members. So in the Chinese community, since you're going to be there all day long, you don't just go to the grave site, you build a mausoleum if you can't afford it. That way you have air conditioning, it's indoors, and that's the process that they follow. So it's an above ground structure that is actually situated with the correct feng shui to enable good luck. So I thought that was very interesting as well. Now, after we were back at the house hosting the family picture and everything was taken care of at the gravesite, that pretty much ended the responsibility. But it didn't end the complete responsibility for certain family members. As I mentioned, my mother-in-law needs to wear white for a year. My sister-in-laws have to wear white for at least 49 days, perhaps a year. But 1 year later, they need to go back and pay respect. And then they need to do it again 3 years later. Very interesting to do that. One other thing I thought was interesting, and this goes back to the wake portion of it, and this was more of a Filipino belief that I really never had fully explained to me. We tried getting more information about this. But when people came to pay their respects at the wake while the body was lying in state, you couldn't greet them or say goodbye to them. They just simply had to arrive, and if they chose to speak with you, you did. And then at some point, they would end the conversation, you would walk away, and then they would leave. A lot of this has to do with, I believe, a belief that you could latch on to the negative energy of death and take it with you. We never really truly found out why that was. And there were other beliefs surrounding that as well. Any kind of food or things that were brought to the church for the wake, we could never take back to our hotel rooms or back home. It was considered bad luck because death would follow. It was made very clear to us that those were things that we weren't supposed to do. So I know this was long. I know it was a bit on the rambly side, but this was my experience dealing with a death in Asia, a death in the Chinese and the Filipino communities, and it was an entirely personal experience for me. Like I said at the beginning, I don't mean for this to be the entire definitive work on Filipino or Chinese or Chinoy death rituals, but it is an account of what I experienced. And I would actually like to hear from you. You know, death is usually a very taboo subject, something that we don't like to talk about, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be. Personally, when my time comes, I'm looking forward to being cremated, looking forward to my family gathering together and honestly celebrating my life, not having a very morbid experience, but having a great celebration of life. I think that's the way it should be. You mourn the loss of the individual, but you celebrate their life. And I really want that for my family. I don't want them to dwell on my passing, but celebrate the life that we had and the life that they can have after I'm done. But I would love to hear from you. What are your family traditions? What are your family's rituals? Have you made plans for what literally is the end of the road? I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. That's it for this week's episode, but you can also keep up with more news from the region by following Asia News Weekly on Facebook and Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your comments, your questions, and even your feedback. Just drop a line to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to this or other podcasts. You can do that in your favorite podcast application like iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, or you can do it at asiannewsweekly.net. Subscribing is free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. Thank you so much for joining me this week. For Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller.